so that you can put them in a hostile environment and they continue to function, even under duress. Something we've been working on for years and years and years. So what does that mean? That means ultimately abstraction has really become a distraction. We've been so focused on the fact that, you don't have to manage this stuff anymore, that we're wondering what it is and how it is that this pure freaking magic just happens and cloud just makes stuff work, when in fact in many cases it doesn't. So what that does is cloud becomes a fantastic forcing function. Makes you say to yourself, okay, if my CEO is going to make me outsource everything to provider A, B, and C, and I no longer have direct functional operational control over my content and applications, I better make sure that those applications themselves, as my so-called perimeters collapse around the information and the VMs and the data itself, that I am focusing on the right things. So a lot of this, the kind of more infrastructure moving parts pieces become potentially less important and lets you kind of whether you want to lean on compliance, whether you want to lean on doing things the right way, or risk assessment, you can start really focusing on things that matter. So staying grounded, kind of literally thinking globally, because you don't necessarily know where in some of these large cloud providers your information and content lives. The notion that really what this has done, cloud computing, has taken this notion of deperimeterization or reperimeterization and put it on steroids. Deperimeterization, as pushed by the Jericho Forum, wasn't really about the fact that you don't have firewalls. It's just the protection mechanisms and how you enforce policy and where start to really morph, as we'll kind of discover. The story we actually get from cloud providers is you should plan for fail. Everything fails. It does all the time. We just will engineer resiliency into our platforms. The interesting thing is that in many cases, in planning for fail, for infrastructure to fail, the applications that get deployed and delivered on these newfound infrastructure actually aren't re-engineered enough to take advantage of the resiliency. It's not so. In this case of abstraction, we just think that the network or the provider will take care of it when something bad happens, and in many cases that's not the case, and people get very, very surprised by this. But you should definitely plan for fail. This notion of public, private, hybrid clouds, all these fancy labels, at the end of the day, it all comes down to trust and trust models. We're going to end up with very hybrid models, as we'll see later on in the presentation. So, understanding where your data is, what's more important, all the things we hear about in terms of risk assessment, and understanding how your data is consumed. It's like a polka group upstairs. So cloud is really an iteration. It's got a beat. I can dance to it. It's an iteration of a platform and an operational model, right? So James Urquhart said, cloud is not a technology, it's an operational model. And if you think about that, it's really true, right? It's how you adapt what you do, where you do it, and how you do it. I know that's Mike Dunn kicking the wall. It is you, isn't it, Mike? So really, the end product here is just focus on the data, right? It's what we're frothing over in the first place. So if we focus on that sort of thing, we keep that in mind. This is really kind of the next question that comes. So, what will cloud bring me? What does this mean to me? My answer is, does it really matter? We see platform shifts and changes all the time, and we kind of wait for the next big thing in order to catch up. Right? I think all of us realize we're never going to catch up, let alone leap ahead. We have the capability, however, to at least think differently and focus on the things that matter. So what are you doing to secure what you have today? Because that's really, really going to govern what this means when you move to this new environment, much like in the way we've had to contemplate what virtualization has done to our internal operations. So can we trust the cloud? Well, I think, ask again later, especially after the end of the presentation, right? The reality is, can you afford not to? And I found the presentation yesterday from Alex Stamos very interesting, because the title of the talk was something like moving your business to the cloud securely. I think that's accurate. What I actually got out of the talk was, actually, you can't trust the cloud. The cloud is a horrifically untrusted, hostile platform. And by the way, all the stuff you used to do in security, you have to do now more, and even more so, in order to deal with some of these changes. And that's kind of an interesting message, because when we get down to it here, as we'll see, hopefully, a lot of the things that we talk about in terms of cloud computing and making it secure is really less about making cloud secure, but making your app secure, which is a very difficult thing, as we all know. So that was the kind of a little bit of a glimpse into the future. Now let's look at the present/past. Anybody know what that is? Anyone guess? Vampire tablet. Nope. Anybody else? It is actually, strangely enough, photographic clamp. Nope. It is actually the accelerator pedal on a Toyota. Now, what is interesting about this is, as a platform, I am told I should trust my minivan. Right? And for the most part, it has a good track record. You know, sometimes bad things happen, airbags go off, sometimes we have collateral damage. But the whole point is this little interesting thing right here. Rare occurrences of excessive friction on contact points. Now, it's rare. It doesn't happen a lot. But when it does, really, really bad things tend to occur. And I think that's interesting because it's rare, yes, but in some cases, potentially tragic. And that's the sticky point with cloud today, is that failures are rare, but the impact radius can be enormous, right? Especially if instead of a minivan, this was a bus that held a couple of hundred people as opposed to 4. So if you think of cloud that way in a kind of automotive analog, you know, there's a big difference. There is a difference between 4 people in a Prius getting in an accident and a couple of hundred in a bus, or worse yet, in an aircraft, et cetera, right? So when I start thinking about platforms, yeah, rare, but I also want to think about what the impact to risk is. So if we set some context, again, cloud is really a natural, iterative platform progression. It's a great response to a converging set of socioeconomic, political, cultural, and technological advances and stimuli. And it's, you know, and in some cases, it's being able to being empowered by a lot of new technology, things we've been trying to do for 20 years. So if you've heard of adaptive enterprise, real-time infrastructure, things about modernization and automation, these are all good things that are coming out of cloud, both in a public utility model as well as private cloud, which we'll talk about in a second. So cloud, if it is an operational model and not a particular technology, points to the fact that there are actually many different kinds of clouds. So not all clouds are created equal. This talk focuses on public cloud computing. We'll talk about why in a couple of minutes. So at the end of the day, the internet, as it relates to the hosting platform for public cloud, assumes some sort of fictional trusted core. But as we heard yesterday in Alex's talk, and I think I'll be able to substantiate it here, it's in fact an untrusted, unreliable, and hostile platform. All the things we do is basically to provide access into this very hostile environment. And cloud kind of exasperates some of that. So if that's the case with the internet, then that should be the case with public cloud. I'm going to talk about that. Really, this comes down to trust, right? It's about how we are going to do things differently, who we're going to trust, and why, and ultimately how. So, what is cloud computing? My old friend Fonzie. You know, two interesting perspectives. There is a very provider or technician clinical view, empirical. I made a picture of NIST's representation with delivery models, deployment models, external essential characteristics. You know, very well abstracted, looks very OSI model-like, stacks, it's got plenty of technical terms. These things, you know, abstracting the infrastructure, democratizing resources, making apps available to everybody, self-provisioning, dynamism, elasticity, scale, all good things. But it invites a whole lot of interesting arguments about what is or isn't cloud. But when you ask business people or IT folks what cloud is, they'll usually tell you Amazon Web Services as infrastructure as a service. They'll talk Google App Engine for platform as a service and Salesforce.com for software as a service. 3 archetypal examples of cloud computing. Now that's interesting, but there's another view of cloud computing, which is basically anything that interacts with or interoperates with my data over the internet on any device and any platform is also cloud. So if you talk to your family members, you talk to folks that aren't in IT, and when you take off your IT geek hat and you use some of the tools and toys that you have today, all of these things, by definition, in some cases, are also cloud. So you sit there and you scratch your head, and a lot of these, the disparate consumerization of IT elements and the technical stuff don't line up very well. So everything is cloud today, right? Which is very difficult then to figure out how applications and services that yesterday were called one thing are now today called cloud. I don't want to debate the validity of either. I think that ultimately both have very interesting things to contribute to this discussion. But what is interesting to me is this kind of cloud journey, as it's called, and its impact on security and vice versa. So I'm going to give you the simple view of how the IT industry essentially paints the journey to cloud computing, with over time an increase in federation, workload portability, and interoperability, which will lead to good stuff. So we started with standalone data centers. Ultimately, standalone data centers started to consolidate, especially with virtualization. We ended up with virtualized data centers. Virtualized data centers then ultimately in parallel with the evolution of cloud computing delivered kind of two very familiar sets of